Hello, everyone. I'm Tina Aswani-Omprakash from SAIA, formerly known as South Asian IBD Alliance, now known as Strategic Alliance for Intercultural Advocacy in GI. We are pleased to welcome you today to Demystifying Environmental Triggers in IBD. We have a stellar role of panelists here today that I'm thrilled to be working with. And please join us for this important patient educational series. Today, we are thrilled to have Dr. Parakkal Deepak kick us off as our moderator.
Thank you, Tina. Hi, I'm Parakkal Deepak. I'm a gastroenterologist at Washington University in St. Louis. I take care of patients with IBD and also do research, particularly focused on refractory IBD. But obviously, we are here today to talk about the environmental triggers in IBD and demystifying them. So let's start by going around the panel for some introductions. Chandrasekhar, do you mind introducing yourself? And if you're comfortable, the diagnosis also.
Oh yeah, for sure. My name's Chandershekhar Shori. I'm a third-year medical student at the UCF College of Medicine. My diagnosis is Crohn's disease, and I also do like IBD research, which I'm super passionate about.
Great. Great to have you here on the panel. Let me also now reach out to our research experts and physicians on this topic and have maybe Manasi go first, followed by Ashwin. If you guys can introduce yourselves and your institutional affiliations.
Yes, thank you, Deepak. And thank you, Tina and Saya, for inviting me to talk today. My name is Manasi Agrawal, and I'm a IBD physician and the director of environmental gastroenterology at Mount Sinai, New York. And it's an honor to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Manasi. Glad to have you here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashwin Ananthakrishnan. I'm director of the Crohn's and Colitis Center at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. And I'm particularly excited to be here on this topic that I think is important to a lot of us in the research community as it is to patients.
Thank you, Ashwin. I'm truly excited for this panel. Sort of brings together patient advocates and clearly IBD gastroenterologists who are particularly focused researchers on this topic. So let's kick this off. Let's start with sort of the broad question of why are we even talking about environment and IBD? So maybe I'll throw this out to Mansi first. For the question of why does environment matter in the context of IBD? Why are we even sort of talking about this today, and why are physicians, particularly yourself and Ashwin and others, interested in studying this relationship between the environment and IBD?
Yes, thank you, Deepak. I think it's a really important question to tackle because of many reasons. First, we know that the incidence of inflammatory bowel disease is rising globally, particularly in countries of Asia and Africa. And this was not the case, many years ago. The historical trends of IBD have followed patterns of globalization, urbanization, and industrial revolution. So that gives us a lot of indirect clues that perhaps it is a modern world that has to do with the increase in IBD. Not just IBD, all of our chronic inflammatory diseases are also rising in the modern world, again, providing indirect evidence. The second point is that genetics explain only a small piece of the puzzle, because we know that it is not purely a genetic disease, and a lot of our IBD patients don't have family history of this disease. And finally, in all of the research that many of our colleagues, Ashwin and we have been doing, we're recognizing how important the environment is, and we found a lot of different signals across diverse aspects of the environment. So all in all, we recognize now that IBD is very, very complex. It's not one risk factor alone. It's not purely genetics alone. And so to be able to make strides towards treating it appropriately, early diagnosis, as well as prevention, it's really important that we understand the causes of IBD.
That's very well put. Ashwin, your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, so to me, the best example for why environment is relevant is just, you look back 20 years ago when I was in medical school, when you were in medical school, Deepak or Mansi, and we all went to medical school in India, did we ever think of being a single person with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis? Right? These were all just terms we saw in the textbook. We never encountered a single patient in years of training. But now, if you go back, there are multiple conferences in regions of the world where IBD was just a textbook term. But now there are conferences on how to manage diseases attended by tons of physicians, tons of patients, recognizing that just in a short lifespan of 20 years, so we're not talking about 50 years or 100 years, we're talking about just 20 years since graduation to medical school to now, the disease has really exploded in so many parts of the world. I think clearly the genetics doesn't change at that pace. And so that highlights the role of the environment.
No, that's again very nicely put. Sort of referencing what we all saw commonly back in medical school just 2 decades ago in training, and how things have changed just in a pretty short period, which clearly genetics alone cannot explain, since genes don't really change that fast. Let me actually now hear from our patient advocates. I'll throw this open to maybe Chandershekhar first, followed by Tina. As IBD patients, how do you understand this research on the role of environment in the development of IBD and flare-ups of the disease? Sort of as patients, what really interests you the most about this topic?
So I think for me, like I've had IBD for most of my life. I was diagnosed when I was 5 or 7. So growing up, like having Crohn's disease, I always thought that this was something that was outside of my control. Flare-ups could happen any time, and just seeing how research has evolved regarding the impact of environmental triggers on IBD, I think as a patient, it gives me some sort of sense of control on like what I can do to help prevent flare-ups, and just things I can do to avoid my disease from getting worse. Because at the end of the environment's something as a patient I can control from my point of view, and IBD to a degree, like it is an autoimmune illness I can't control, but at least the environment I can control, which can help give me some sort of control over my life, rather than me feeling like my disease defines how I live.
Yeah, no, of course, and this is very important for us to understand as physicians. Of course, beyond the sort of the research on the disease, especially from the environment perspective, but also sort of how this sort of helps the patients, in a sense, define their journey with the disease. Tina, your thoughts on this?
This is an interesting question because I think there's a lot. I would say this question's a bit loaded in the sense that, I always thought IBD was something that was very, very genetic, and that no matter what I did to avoid it, in my family particularly, my father, my aunt, my sister, a bunch of us have IBD. And I'm just like, could I have done anything to avoid this? Plus, like culturally speaking, I think there's that element for me, at least, where I felt like, oh my God, did I do something to bring this on? Is this my fault? And people often ask me that, like, did you eat or drink something? Like, what did you do to get this disease? And so I guess for me, it was one of those things where I was just wondering, is there a role of anything beyond genetics that's at play here? And so it's nice to see some of this research starting to come out, talking about, what else is involved in the development of IBD, and what else do we know? So I'm really excited to see what comes out of this talk today.
No, that's again.
Yeah. If I can jump in.
Sure,
if I can
sorry,
say
Ashwin,
what
go
we
ahead.
hear from our patients, right? Like we hear from our patients, we've been hearing from patients for decades now that, I was doing fine, and then, something happened, something stressful, something dietary. And for many, many, many years, we were telling them that's absolutely not the case. There's nothing you could have done that influences your disease. And now we recognize with all the tools we have to study the environment, it's still not something that you're doing, but something that the environment is doing to you that can influence the disease and can modify. So it's sort of a full circle where we were sort of closing the doors, that now we are, opening the doors and joining the patients where they have been for years.
No, that's great. And I think maybe this is a great segue to the next portion. We sort of start getting into the sort of the depths of what some of these triggers are. And I did hear the word diet mentioned by you, Ashwin, just now. So if you can sort of maybe go a little deeper into sort of what you view based on, of course, your own research and that of others so far. What do we know about the role of diet in IBD in terms of course, development of disease as well as once you have the disease potentially in terms of flares? So yeah, if you can go into a little more detail on that.
Yeah. So if we take a step back, right, I think we always start our discussion with trying to understand why people develop IBD, right? And we recognize it's not one thing or the other. It's a combination of multiple different factors at different points in someone's life. Genetics clearly does play a role. Family history still is a very important, relevant risk factor. But genes together explain only about 25% of why somebody develops IBD, even if you have their entire genetic information. That's as much as you're ever going to be able to predict whether someone will develop IBD or not. So it's still, even with 200 genes, it's a small minority. We recognize that those genes affect how your immune system responds to your intestinal bacteria. And that's where a lot of the focus was on how these genetic defects result in how your immune system is interacting with the bacteria. But now we recognize that a very important part of the puzzle are other factors that can influence your bacteria and can influence the immune system beyond just genes, right? And a very relevant factor in reference to what influences your bacteria is diet. Multiple studies have shown that what you eat from the time of infancy affects how your intestinal bacterial composition is, what kind of bacteria you have, and how they work. And so now we have the tools to say, okay, people eating these kind of diets may be more prone to various chronic inflammatory diseases, including IBD. For example, a diet that is low in fruits and vegetables, that's sort of been the case in many regions of the world that over the past few decades, we're eating less fruits and vegetables, we're eating more processed foods, we're eating more saturated and trans fats. And so both these changes, both not eating the things that are protective and potentially eating more of the things that are pro-inflammatory, are both altering how your intestinal bacteria look. And so your immune system is no longer able to recognize it as something it should be tolerating, but instead it's recognizing your bacteria as an aggressor and then starting to respond to that.
That's a really nice explanation. Maybe Manasi, also your thoughts on diet in IBD, and then we can sort of keep going through some of the other triggers for some of the next questions.
Yes, absolutely. I think diet in IBD is so important. This is something that, every single person is exposed to multiple times every single day. There is so much variability in our diet over time, over the calendar period. Our diet has changed substantially in the modern world, as well as there are differences across culture, across communities, rural to urban differences. And so the diet is a really, really important factor. In addition to all of the important points that Ashwin touched on, another aspect of diet, particular to ultra-processed foods, which basically are foods that have a lot of industrial processing to enhance their shelf life and to give them a very strong flavor, it contains ingredients and additives and chemicals that are normally not used in our home cooking. So in the process of all of the industrial manufacturing and storage and transportation, a lot of different chemicals get added to ultra-processed foods. And many of these individual chemicals, for example, microplastics and PFAS chemicals and phthalates, etc., have been linked with microbial disruptions and with intestinal inflammation. So there are a lot of indirect clues. And I think that this concept of food contact contaminants, so all of these chemicals that are a part of the ultra-processed foods and they seep into our very individual environments is important to consider also.
Yeah, so one of the questions that's come in here looks like is a question on how folks have developed IBD in sort of different parts of some have been in India, some have sort of moved to another country and then developed IBD. Some thoughts around that. Like I know there have been studies in this context. If you want to comment, maybe I'll hear from you, Manasi, and then have Ashwin also give his thoughts on that.
I think we see a lot of these trends that with immigration from a low incidence country, meaning where IBD is not so common, to a country where IBD is more common, which is typically the pattern of immigration, there are changes in IBD, and not just IBD, there are changes in immune-mediated diseases such as lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, etc. Particularly with respect to IBD, we also in our research have found that when folks move in the parents, so in the first generation who move, the risk of IBD we found was similar to the country that they came from, whereas in their children, in the subsequent generation, the risk increases and becomes comparable to the risk in the country that they moved to. We think this has to do with the environment because the genetics remain the same, right? And perhaps the early life period is very important. So the country that you were born in and the country that you spend the first few years of life, because that period is of very high vulnerability and it imprints the later risk of disease and health. So perhaps it is the early life period, or it is a composite of early life period and downstream events. But definitely, I think this is a really important point about migrating and the change in the environment.
Thank you, Manasi. That was very enlightening. I guess, Ashwin, your take on some of these migration patterns and how perhaps diet plays a role or other factors you think might be implicated.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things. I think I don't want to sort of emphasize what Mansi said beyond just saying that early life environment does seem to be important because you are seeing a clear increase in risk in people who are born in high incidence countries, even if they're originally from a low incidence country by origin, whether that's because of external, broad societal environmental influences, whether it's individual cultural changes, either habits they're giving up or new habits that they're picking up. I think it's probably a component of all those different things. I don't think we've been able to clearly tease out why, but it is a pattern that seems to be fairly uniform from almost any low incidence country to almost any high incidence country. It's also interesting that the children seem to be developing IBD at a younger age as well. And this is, true of Asian immigrants, true of Hispanic immigrants. Generally, the second generation that is at a higher risk for IBD seems to be developing the disease earlier as well. So, that's interesting. We don't have answers to that yet.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Maybe getting into a slightly different trigger, which is sort of the role of stress as a IBD trigger. I was going to sort of pose this question, of course, and to both Chandrasekhar and Tina. I mean, you guys obviously lead very busy lives, really high impact lives. So as a medical student, Chandrasekhar and Tina as a CEO of a nonprofit organization, you guys are navigating stressful careers and have a lot of things to manage, right, in terms of managing your illnesses and diet. So how do you sort of navigate this relationship between diet, stress, and IBD, or things you've kind of learned over time as strategies to sort of manage stress and obviously balance the diet and sort of how you manage your disease? So Chandrasekhar, if you want to go first, and then also hear from Tina.
Yeah, for sure. So being a medical student, especially since I'm in my third year now, managing IBD is definitely a lot more challenging because basically in third year medical school, working long hours, also to come home and study. And so, at least as a patient, I can't take a risk of my disease flaring up because that means I could be missing a day of clinic or be falling behind on school, just falling behind on multiple things. Because I'm also, as medical students, we're juggling not only school, extracurriculars, research, and all this stuff. As a patient, to make sure I'm reducing my chances of having a flare or causing an exacerbation of my symptoms, I try to control my environment as much as possible. For example, from a diet point of view, I pretty much try to keep a very consistent diet. For example, I can go for at least during a week, I will try to avoid food. I'll try to keep a very consistent diet, maybe eating the same exact sandwich for 5 days in order to make sure I'm keeping my diet as controlled as possible so I don't trigger a flare. And as medical students, for example, I'm going out with my friends. I will never try like anything new like on a weekday because I don't want to risk like having a flare up in the middle of in the middle of a week. I'll try to limit like trying new foods or trying anything new on a Friday just because it's new. I don't like doing experimentations from a diet point of view on a weekday at least. Just because weekdays are always busy. And aside from that, just in regards to stress, medical school is stressful just given our busy schedules. Something that I used to compromise on before, but not anymore, is definitely sleep. Because realistically speaking, yes, I could stay up an extra hour or two studying, staying up studying for my exams. At the end of the day, that could potentially exacerbate my symptoms. And if my symptoms get exacerbated, I could be sick for maybe 1, 2, 3 days, and that's just given my busy schedule, that's something I just realistically cannot afford. So sleep is something I definitely don't compromise on. I try to get as much sleep as possible, and just given as medicine has evolved, with IBD, technology has also evolved. So there's multiple apps that I use to like monitor my diet, like just to make sure to monitor my calories, what I'm eating, and just kind of keeping track of like how my bowel movements, all those kinds of things look to make sure to kind of understand how what I'm eating, what my stress levels are is impacting my bowel movements because bowel movements are always a big part of IBD, and just trying to control, just trying to limit, especially closer to exam season when I have exams, I try to pretty much avoid because exam season is stressful because we have to study for exams, make sure we're doing well for our future careers and all that. I try to once again just control my diet, avoid eating out, and just kind of keep as much of a controlled thing, a controlled life as possible in regards to managing my IBD.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you for actually that, very detailed explanation of how you manage this. Clearly, I mean, you're doing a fine job with that. Tina, I know, obviously I've worked with you personally or now multiple years, and I know what sort of a really busy life you have led, right? Growing, building up SAIA and the many other sort of advocacy work you do across the disease state. So, how do you manage stress, diet, and avoiding flares while living with the disease?
I think for me, this is such a great question, Deepak, and I loved your response to that, Chandrasekhar. I would say I do a lot of what you do too, especially during the work week. And especially when I'm traveling, because I have to travel a lot in this work, I would say I carry a lot of foods that I feel safe using as natural of the protein bars I can buy, whatever's organic that I can carry. I also try to look at ingredients of everything. So I'm doing my best, like especially if I'm buying like almond milk and things like soy milk. There's a lot of carrageenan and methyl cellulose. There's a lot of glues and gums and things. I try to pick up things that the brands that don't have any of that in there, even if it means that they expire faster. I think we just have to be really conscious of today's environment and taking care of ourselves to the best of our abilities. That's my whole thing, Deepak and team. And then in terms of sleep, I think Chandrasekhar mentioned this as well. I'm doing the best I can to try to get 8 hours of sleep a night. I think that's absolutely essential. And my whole thing is trying to keep my stress levels down and, letting things go, letting things be. They will work out. Our health is number one. That's what I try to remind myself every day as like a mantra, that everything will work itself out. But as long as I have my health, everything else is okay. This moment we lose our health is the moment that I feel like things start to slip. So that's my 2 cents. I guess, I want to ask the doctors and sort of flip it back to you all. There's a lot of different environmental triggers, right? We've talked about diet and stress, but I guess one of the things that's starting to come up a lot now, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Manasi, Ashwin, and Deepak, like about the role of microplastics, PFAS, some of these toxic pollutants, chemicals, whether that's like air pollutants, whether that's water pollutants. I'm just kind of curious to hear, what's the latest research on this and what are you telling your patients with regards to these things? Maybe we start with Manasi first?
Yes, so thank you, Tina. That's an excellent question. What is the information out there? Because there's a lot of good information and a lot of misinformation. What do we do with it, and how do we transcribe that into our daily lives, right? So with respect to microplastics, there are now a lot of data on first microplastics being detected in different tissues of our body. So they've been reported in stool, they've been reported in the colon, in our lung tissue, in various organs of the body. While this is a very important finding, we also have to be mindful of the methodology that is used to collect the samples and the methodology that's used to measure microplastics, because oftentimes, depending on the methods that are used, they may not be the most rigorous, and there can be errors alongside that. So just to put it in context. Second, with respect to intestinal inflammation, we also are doing a study on microplastics and Crohn's disease. We call that study PLANET. And in PLANET, we found that microplastics were detected in all of the samples that we studied in. So certainly we are very microplastics exposed. We sort of found a trend towards microplastics being related with fecal calprotectin. However, our sample size was quite small. But we did see differences in the size of microplastics based on IBD status. So all of that to say that there does seem to be a relationship between microplastics and intestinal inflammation, but these data are fairly early. So we have to be very nuanced and careful in how to interpret them. There's a lot of research that is ongoing by our group, by other groups, and we will get a lot of more exciting updates in the coming, months to years. But that is what we have so far. Now, in terms of what we can do, I think the simplest things that we can do is to avoid, to the extent possible, single-use plastic in our lives. For example, beverages that come out of single-use plastic bottles, because there is convincing research that these plastic bottles lead to a lot of micro and nanoplastics within the water itself with a very high concentration. Avoid using plastic containers, avoid heating them, avoid putting them in the microwave or hot foods in them, because heat leads to breakdown of these plastics and increased risk of these plastics getting into our food and therefore into our systems. So these are some of the small things that we can do with respect to microplastics: avoiding polyester clothing, avoiding furniture that contain synthetic fibers like nylons, preferring natural fibers. It's not easy to do, considering how in our modern life we're surrounded by plastics, and plastics are also very helpful in day-to-day living. But to the extent that's possible, perhaps making small changes at a time. And this will lower our exposure not just to microplastics, but also to PFAS chemicals and other related chemicals, because all of these coexist and all of these are very highly correlated. Finally, with respect to pesticides, you mentioned, Tina, organic foods. These are not easy to come by. They're always more expensive. So that caveat is certainly there. But now research has shown that eating produce eating produce that's not organic is associated with higher levels of pesticides in urine samples. Whether that translates into intestinal inflammation, more research is needed in that space. But for those foods that we eat with the peel, for example, berries, it may be reasonable to favor organic to the extent that's possible. Whereas for vegetables that are peeled and fruits that are peeled, maybe it's peeling them is one way. Certainly, washing your produce thoroughly is very important. So all of these caveats we can implement in our lives, again, to the extent that's possible, and not stressing ourselves out or trying to go completely to the extreme side, because all of this research is work in progress and new data are coming out in the coming months and years.
Maybe we can have Ashwin comment next on some of this.
Yeah, so I mean, I think all excellent points made by everybody, and I think I had a lot of takeaways from everything that all of you said. Right, I think from Chandershekhar and Tina's experience, you see how the environment is very relevant, but you can still have very busy full lives, any career possible with a condition that still has a strong environmental influence. You don't hear either of them holding back on what they're doing in spite of their stresses posed by the environment. And I think that's very important for all of us to recognize.
And Deepak, what about you? Any thoughts on some of these forever chemicals?
Yeah, I think Manasi put it very well. I would say personally, in my own life, I mean, and I think this is sort of, some of the points she is mentioned. I've been actually making this a point even personally in my own life of being very mindful, every time you reach out to, let's say, a plastic container, making sure you transfer it into, let's say, a glass-based container, some kind of silicone covers, etc. Things that are not, clearly, plastic containers. I mean, again, I think things like, for example, water, right? Like you often observe, and again, nothing wrong with this, of the single-use plastic bottles, folks buying it in airports, etc., versus most airports, at least thankfully in the US, are now equipped with these sort of, areas where you can, refill your bottle, right? Like, and, carrying an appropriate container for that. Like, so simple changes at an individual level, I think, is what I recommend at the moment, because I think, as Manasi said, this research is evolving, right? So you do sort of, I mean, I think we all can sort of play our part in cutting down single-use plastic, but I think in our own lives, being a little more mindful, certainly of the things that sort of interact with what you eat or drink, I think it's probably a good place to start. I think that's, kind of probably what I believe that at. And that's sort of what I, tend to advise my patients also. I think food, again, it's a tough topic, right? And again, in terms of, because there are food deserts, as we know, in the US, where grocery stores are probably not as easily available as they should be. But I would say, again, you're sort of encouraging people to shop at their local farmers market, if possible, more so than, big brand chains. I mean, again, you're more likely to run into organic food rather than, sort of the increasing use of pesticides.
Yeah. Another point that I can add here is about, speaking of PFAS chemicals, I think the research on PFAS has been going on for more time, and there are stronger data out there linking PFAS levels with increased risk of both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And PFAS are also linked with many other adverse health outcomes. So I think another point that I share with my patients, because they ask me this question all the time, is to try to also phase out non-stick cookware, because these coatings are made of PFTE and other PFAS materials, and not just the original legacy PFAS, but even the newer PFAS chemicals are being found to be harmful. And again, not just for inflammatory bowel disease, but for many, many different health outcomes. Once this coating gets disrupted, it gets a scratch on it, it becomes even more easy for these chemicals to get incorporated in the food that we're cooking. And so again, slowly, perhaps one utensil at a time, to the extent that's possible for the family, preferring the use of, for example, cast iron or stainless steel, which are very inert materials, over nonstick cookware. I think that is something that we could try to implement in our kitchens.
Okay. So if I can jump in, right? I do want to. I think this is all exciting, but you can also see how overwhelming and exhausting it can be to try to control every aspect of your environment, right? And so I think it really is important for us to take a few steps back to set out sort of broad things that people can do that have been proven to affect IBD outcomes. There are a number of sort of exciting areas that we're talking about here that in a few years, we may have clear data that they may affect progression of IBD or not. But at this time, there is data that they generally may not be great for health, but nothing specific to IBD. So I do want to sort of bring it back a little bit to what exactly we know about IBD and what people can do. So at sort of the very broadest environmental exposures, I would say make sure people eat enough fresh fruits and vegetables, because there is data that they cause beneficial changes in the microbiome. And to the extent possible, avoid ultra-processed foods to the extent possible, right? It doesn't mean don't ever have a potato chip, or I think we want to recognize that we all have busy lives. There's a lot of convenience that ultra-processed foods give us, and we don't want to be in a setting where you don't travel because you cannot carry your food with you everywhere, which a lot of people like Tina have to make the extra effort to make sure it's not easy to have to do that degree of planning, and not everybody would be able to do that. So it is okay once in a while to be exposed to those things. You want to sort of minimize it as much as possible. Recognize the effect stress has on disease, and it doesn't mean you need to have sort of the least stress job possible, but recognize you may have to schedule yourself some downtimes if you're going through particularly stressful periods to allow you to recover. Recognize the importance of sleep. Again, it doesn't mean you need 8 hours before every exam like Chandershekhar, but you make sure that if you're building up a sleep debt, that again you just schedule yourself some time off. So be kind to your body with regards to those things. And those are the things that have been shown at this time to clearly affect IBD outcomes. The one other point I want to make is that not every symptom that's brought on by this is necessarily inflammation, right? So it's not like you ate something, you have diarrhea, and that means your Crohn's or ulcerative colitis is out of control now. A lot of these environmental exposures affect symptoms disproportionately so than they do inflammation. It's sort of the cumulative exposure that is relevant to inflammation. In the short term, 1-to-1, the relationship is more just with symptoms, and it's not damage that you're causing yourself. And so certainly it's not a cause for blame.
No, thank you, Ashwin. I think sort of this really nice sort of discussion around dose effect relationships, which obviously we tend to think of it in terms of medications, but also in terms of exposures, and hopefully some of that's sort of what will become more obvious in the next several years of some of these environmental triggers, if it's like a one-time hit versus sort of a cumulative dose relationships, which then may mean that sort of reducing that exposure dose may be sort of all that's necessary. Again, you can't really sort of just avoid everything, and also the sort of the idea that, again, let's not necessarily again view the environmental triggers again in a way where some patients feel like, well, they did something and they sort of caused the flare. I mean, so that's not really the idea, but more sort of recognizing it, mitigating it, but maybe hard to like completely avoid it. So some of the other questions that have come in here, maybe sort of more from maybe a perspective of especially I think prospective parents and thinking like how things can be potentially modified from their kids' perspective. So going back a little bit again back in things that Manasi had discussed briefly, sort of the early life exposures. So I think one key question that has come up from the audience is the question of exposure to antibiotics in the early life. What's the research around it? And sort of, again, the question of should we really be avoiding antibiotics at all costs, right? And sort of what do we know about that? Maybe have you comment on that, Manasi, first, followed by Ashwin.
So that's an excellent question. So first, the early life period, as we were discussing earlier, is a critical period. It's a period of vulnerability. And there are a lot of data now on how important good health during this period is towards health later in life, including in adulthood. And specifically with respect to IBD, many different early life factors have been linked with later risk of IBD, especially more so pediatric onset disease than adult onset disease. Antibiotics are also an established factor for IBD, both pediatric and later onset. Now, in early life, our group and many other groups have demonstrated that broad spectrum antibiotics and multiple courses of antibiotics are associated with a greater risk than fewer antibiotics. And that sort of makes sense, right? Because we know that when we give one course of antibiotics or something that's targeting a more narrow range of bacteria, fewer bacteria, then the gut microbiome, which gets altered after the antibiotic course, bounces back faster and to a greater degree. But if there are prolonged courses of antibiotics or repeated courses or broader spectrum antibiotics, this return of the microbiome is less so. So this is not to say that not to prescribe antibiotics, because antibiotics can be life-saving. When antibiotics are needed, of course, they have to be prescribed. It is just to say that this exposure antibiotics has been linked with later disease risk. And so we need to tease out what this pathway is, one, and two, advocate for judicious use of antibiotics. So we have to be careful about giving, making sure the antibiotic is absolutely needed, only giving it then, and giving it as narrow a spectrum as possible for the shortest duration that is needed. If it's needed, then it's needed. But being very careful and thoughtful about antibiotic use, I think, is the key point.
Thank you. Very well said. Ashwin, your take on it.
Yeah, so I want to sort of expand beyond just antibiotics. I think Manasi covered all the points about antibiotics, but the question about prevention in prospective parents, right, who are considering having children.
Yes.
I always start out my discussion saying, even if you have IBD, the likelihood that your offspring will have IBD is incredibly low. Right? A lot of patients worried that, if they have IBD, every child of theirs will have IBD. Studies have shown that with one parent with IBD, the lifetime risk in the child is 6, 7, 8%. So it is higher than if they didn't have IBD, but certainly it's still a minority of offspring who will develop IBD. Vast majority of GI symptoms that every child will have, even in somebody with IBD, is not going to be IBD. So you don't have to immediately go into the spiral of every diarrhea means my child also has Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. I think that's really, really important for people to remember and get that number. What can you do, right? IBD is not entirely preventable, right? So if your child gets IBD, it's absolutely not your fault in any way. But to the extent what you can control that may reduce the risk of IBD in your child is if you're able to breastfeed. Studies have generally shown that children who are breastfed are less likely to develop IBD and other autoimmune diseases. That's sort of consistent across the globe. So if it is possible, that makes a difference. Ensuring a diverse diet. Studies have shown that diet diversity as early as 1 year influences future risk of developing IBD. So making sure, again, that you're limiting the exposure to ultra-processed foods, ensuring adequate fruits and vegetables. So it's not just avoiding ultra-processed foods, but also adding in a lot of beneficial stuff, and reducing exposure to antibiotics where possible. Like Manasi said, I think those are the 3 important things that can be done that may reduce the risk of IBD in your offspring to the extent we can.
Oh, thank you, Ashwin. That was very helpful. I guess, Manasi, any thoughts from your end on this question of prevention and sort of how do you sort of counsel your patients, and any other factors you might think of beyond, of course, the ones Ashwin mentioned, or in addition to that?
Yeah, I think IBD is so complex that there's so many different factors we have to think about. Additional considerations that we can implement potentially at the individual level is, one, minimizing exposure to smoke. And this includes cigarette smoking, so avoiding smoking, avoiding passive exposure to smoke for the baby, because that's also an important early life risk factor. Air pollution too, again, it's not in our control when we live in urban spaces, but to the extent possible, taking walks in green space, exercising. And this has to do not just with lack of exposure to smoke, but also being in green space is associated with less stress. And so there, I think, multiple variables that lead to green space being associated with improved outcomes. Exercise is an important one. Being exposed to more biodiversity, more nature. So again, going for walks, exercising, being in green areas by nature. Some studies have also, some small data have also linked having pets, and that may be associated with improved outcomes. Certainly, having pets are associated with improved or more diverse gut microbiome. So that may have a beneficial effect. And then with breastfeeding, I also want to add that in addition to breastfeeding, it's also important to consider that because breastfeeding is very, very challenging, and it's associated with a lot of caveats for both the mother and the offspring. So the formula that the baby may need also should be something to be thought about, how natural it is, how many chemicals, because oftentimes formulas contain additive agents, external sugars, and emulsifiers. So identifying and making sure that the formula is minimally processed to the extent that's possible. Another consideration is early introduction of external foods, referencing what Ashwin said about diet diversity. And there are studies that early introduction of gluten and peanuts decreases the risk of celiac disease, decreases the risk of peanut allergy. This is not directly related to IBD, but indirectly it suggests that when you give baby early introduce them to diverse foods, it helps build up tolerance in their gut. So it's a very complex space, this early life period, and we're still learning as we're going. But these are some of the things to think about.
Those are a question I think also here about the mode of delivery. Does that matter? Any data around that? And maybe have you speak on that, Manasi, and then your take, Ashwin.
Yes, so there have been a lot of studies on mode of delivery, meaning C-section versus vaginal delivery, and the risk of IBD in the offspring. And a lot of these data are retrospective, meaning looking behind or looking back. And these are rather small studies. So we conducted a systematic review incorporating data from all of these studies and did not found any clear differences. So I would say there are no clear differences with respect to IBD risk between C-section and vaginal delivery. So C-section doesn't necessarily increase the risk of IBD. That said, again, it's a major surgery. So similar to antibiotics, if it's needed, of course. But just being thoughtful and judicious about all of these treatments would be important.
Sure. Great. Ashwin, your take.
Yeah, no, in general, there's no link between mode of delivery. There's no convincing evidence that mode of delivery affects risk of IBD. There is no evidence that vaccination behavior in infancy affects subsequent risk of IBD as well. I think we can be fairly certain that there is no evidence convincingly for either of those risk factors.
Okay, no, that's great. One of the questions I think often comes up is the role of flares, IBD flares, and how any sort of seasonal changes, any association between like change of seasons and IBD flares. So maybe a question for you, Ashwin, followed by Manasi. Is there any data around that, or do you talk about that, mention it in your discussions with patients?
Yeah, so while a lot of the research we have talked about so far and are extrapolating, most of the studies have looked at people developing IBD and their exposure when they're otherwise healthy. There are far fewer studies that have prospectively tracked people with IBD to see if these factors have the same effect. For some factors, we do know that's the case. Cigarette smoking, for example, in Crohn's is associated with more aggressive Crohn's disease, associated with higher risk of surgery, higher risk of recurrence after surgery. There is some data on sort of a high fiber diet being associated with a reduced risk of flares. The data is slightly mixed, I must acknowledge, but there is some data. There is some data that red meat intake is potentially associated with a higher risk of flares in ulcerative colitis. Again, the data is somewhat mixed. And the same thing holds true for like ultra-processed foods as well. There's some data that is linked to intestinal inflammation. Again, the data is all mixed. So these are the three things I think you can prevent. There is data cumulatively that stress also can affect risks of flare-ups, though the vast majority of immediate symptoms after stress are not from inflammation. They're just sort of symptoms in terms of how stress affects your intestinal transit and the nerves, and not actually resulting in inflammation. We don't know like if somebody flares up, how far back do you look to find the trigger, right? In most people, it is not a one-to-one. It's not that I'm flaring now because I ate this 2 days ago. Those kind of things are not your bowel flares. You probably have had simmering inflammation for several weeks before you start getting symptomatic. Most studies have shown that calprotectin begins to rise at least 3 months before people develop symptoms. So it's usually not an immediate past event that is triggering the flare up. And physical activity seems to be associated with reduced risk of flare up. So again, the really fun thing about talking about environment in IBD is that all the things that you want people to do, you want them to do for so many different reasons, right? There's not really anything you need to do purely for their IBD, like more physical activity, eat fruits and vegetables, avoid ultra-processed foods, try to reduce the amount of stress in your life, get enough sleep, maintain a healthy weight. All these have so many benefits beyond just your IBD that it's actually a fun thing for everybody in the family to be involved in. You don't have to be sort of like the separate person with IBD doing all these different things. If anybody's family does a lot of these things, then the whole family is going to be healthier. And I think that's sort of the really fun part.
Sure. Thank you, Ashwin. I guess, Manasi, maybe a quick take from you, and then I'll turn over to some thoughts from our patient advocates who are on it.
I think Ashwin put it very eloquently about the different things that we can consider to minimize the risk of flares, and also different folks have different triggers for their flares. Another thing to consider, going back to a previous comment that was made, is that a flare, the gut-brain axis, it's such a tight connection between the brain and the gut that oftentimes many foods, for example, dairy or gluten, or stressful situations can trigger symptoms, but that doesn't translate to inflammation. It's more because of visceral hypersensitivity. So that is another point to keep in mind. With respect to environmental pollutants and data around that, those are very much very, very preliminary in the context of flares and disease outcomes. There do seem to be relationships with air pollution. So particulate matter has been associated with worse IBD outcomes in individuals who already have the disease. But then again, those data are small and they warrant larger studies. Cigarette smoking, as Ashwin alluded to, is an important thing to avoid. Yeah, all of these factors that we discussed, remaining healthy overall is helpful in all aspects of life for the individual and for the family. So I completely echo Ashwin's comments.
The one thing we haven't sort of talked on, Deepak, if I can sort of jump back in.
Sure.
Right? We've spent 50 minutes talking about the environment. We haven't talked about medications at all, and I feel like that is sort of a flawed perception that many people have, in that you either talk about medications or you talk about environment, and that they're really like mutually exclusive things. And there's no mention of medications in an environmental talk, no mention of the environment in a medication talk. But that's like, I feel that's like absolutely silly, because we need all the help we can get to stay healthy. Even in somebody on medications, environment is critically important to keep them healthy. So it's not that you're either just modifying your environment or you're taking medications. And it also doesn't mean that if you want to modify your environment, then you stay off medications. The way I tell my patients, it's you need the help from both. The medications help you stay away from the edge of the cliff, a little bit further off the edge of the cliff, so that just with the winds that life throws at you, you don't fall off. You can not control. Your control is not quite so fragile if you are in deep remission with a lot of these environmental triggers. And so you take advantage of everything science has to offer, whether it's medications, whether it's environmental research, to stay healthy.
Yeah, no, I think that was a sort of a key point to make, because I think we've all taken care of patients who clearly have been in remission with medications, but then some very significant life stressor event happens, especially sort of to invoke stress, and then sort of the flare happens, and even often the patient recognizes that sentinel event, and being able to then sort of deal with that, get over that, get some sort of back into remission without potentially even like changing a medication, or in some cases you may have to use additional help. So I think in the last few minutes of this, I did want to turn back to our patient advocates sort of. So obviously with this sort of wealth of information out there, definitely sort of a broad concept of healthy living, which I think has been brought up, could be applied to even things outside of IBD. So it's good in general. But with all these sort of environmental factors, we know, again, acknowledging the data is not perfect. How do you think patients and caregivers can use this data, and then potential changes they can make? Some changes you may have made yourself. Use some of this data as you've learned this over time. We hear from you, Tina, followed by Chandrasekhar.
No, thank you so much for all the points you all have been making. It's been so enlightening today. I just want to say, on my end, and this has taken a lot of therapy and a lot of growth to really start reflecting on, is that, small changes can be empowering. It's important not to beat ourselves up over what we can't do. Just like Dr. Ashwin, even all the doctors have been saying, if we have to eat some ultra processed foods, we understand, especially sometimes when you've got to travel or you're going to a birthday party or something like that, it's unavoidable and it is convenient. But at the same time, what we bring into our homes, maybe we be a little bit more careful about. And maybe just staying on top of sleep and stress levels. It's important not to beat ourselves up over this and shame and blame ourselves. And also, whatever shame or blame we might feel from family or friends, it's important to just take with a grain of salt. We know our disease is the best. We're doing the best we can. We haven't done this to ourselves, and I think it's important to remember that. And it's important to, not be alarmed by this information, but to use it to empower ourselves. I totally agree with Drs. Ashwin and Deepak, trying to think about this as conventional therapies, taking them side by side by making sure we also improve some of the aspects of environmental health that we can take care of. Do we need an antibiotic? Sure. If we absolutely need it, we take it. Whether it's for IBD or non-IBD, sometimes we have to. It's important to recognize that balance in life, and important to recognize that we should stay on top of our treatment options or medications, but also do things side by side where and when we can, and not shame and blame ourselves.
Well said. Chandrasekhar, your thoughts?
First, I want to thank all the doctors for taking the time to educate us on this topic. Overall, just my thoughts on everything we've discussed so far. It seems like that, from my understanding, is that it definitely seems promising for the future of IBD, and just how much patients can have control of their symptoms. Obviously, managing environmental triggers isn't a full-on cure for your symptoms, but it does help in providing patients more control over their disease, because this is a chronic condition, a lifelong condition, and that sometimes it can feel like that this condition is controlling your life, but knowing that there are some environmental triggers that can be controlled from a patient's point of view, that definitely is promising and provides hope from a patient's point of view. And just in regards to what healthcare providers and patients can do, obviously IBD is it is a multifactorial disease that incorporates not only the biological processes behind it, but the psychosocial factors as well. With that in mind, I think it's important that the multidisciplinary approach we take into caring for IBD patients, incorporating not just care from gastroenterologists, but primary care providers as well, who have a better understanding of the patient as a whole, and just trying to focus on educating patients not only on what the disease is and current medical treatment options available, but also educating patients on these environmental triggers that we've discussed, and how patients and educating them on how they can control these environmental triggers to have better management of their disease.
No, thank you, Chandrasekhar. Again, thank you for your thoughts. So I think in the last few minutes here, just to sort of summarize, a lot of that has been discussed here. I think we've clearly, I think hopefully the audience has appreciated here sort of the importance of environmental triggers in IBD. I think as Manasi and Ashwin put it very nicely, genetics really explain maybe like 25% or so of the disease we see out there, despite the 200 plus genes that have been studied. Clearly, the disease has sort of rapidly accelerated. And again, some very nice publications out there on the faces of this out there, especially comes to newly developing countries out there, which clearly really highlights the role of environment in this disease. Now, having said that, I think we've sort of made this careful differentiation between some things where there's more data versus less data. The idea generally of a lot of things are generally probably part of a general healthy living strategy that could be applied to life in general and other diseases, not just IBD, and can be done at a family level, not just the patient with IBD. And I think this really is also, in a sense, empowering, as we heard from the patients, that there are certain things they feel now that they can do outside of the clinic by themselves to kind of keep control of their disease and lead fulfilling, successful lives. But I think also the point made that this is not one or the other. We have medications, constantly research going on in that, but there are also certain, I think it's important to recognize that certain life events in the patient's lives can also produce changes in disease activity, and really setting up multidisciplinary clinics, I think, as Chandershekhar said at the very end, that really sort of help sort of life management in general to keep the patient in remission and importantly doing what they would like to do. So that's sort of summary from my end, and obviously there's several gaps that we are still working on. Researchers such as Ashwin and Manasi are working on actively. So we'll hear more in the next several years. I'm sure this will be a talk that gets repeated with more data down the line. And I'll turn it back to Tina.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Deepak, for moderating. Manasi and Ashwin, do you have a few comments just to close us off, and then we'll close off the talk? Manasi, go ahead.
I just want to echo what has already been said. The role of the environment is critical in disease onset, but also having this collaboration and this patient-physician relationship between the doctor and the patient, and having shared decision making, addressing medications, making sure that the disease is in remission, all of that alongside the environment is critical. And again, another aspect is being informed and educated. And I think having sessions such as this one are very important in this regard, because as more research becomes available and we get more and more data, perhaps there may be contradictory findings to what we've discussed. And so our patients being informed and being educated is a big aspect of staying empowered. And so thank you so much for this great session.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the future in environmental research is exciting. I think Manasi talked about a lot of work she and other groups are doing that are going to help us quantify a lot of exposures beyond what we can currently measure. Just like we don't blame ourselves when medications are not working, we shouldn't blame ourselves for when the environment is not entirely under our control as well. But that being said, there are a lot of active things that we can do that can help us stay healthier. And I think so we support environmental research. That's critically important. Keep mentioning to your patients, to your physicians and other providers, they need to hear how important the environment is to you and your disease. That's critically important. And then we, in 2 years, if we have this again, we're going to have a ton of new data.
Love that. And I love the baby chiming in to reiterate all this too. Thank you everyone for joining us today, for your time on a Saturday. We appreciate you all. And this was a fantastic talk. From SAIA, feel free to check out our patient resources, our educational videos, as well as our digital resources on our website. Thank you all so much. Take care.